Well, I may seem a little bit sluggish to you today, and that's Thanksgiving dinner last night. Oh, it was so good. And some of the remnants made it out today. We had 14 around the table. Classic Thanksgiving dinner with turkey and a couple of kinds of dressing and sweet potato casserole, which is kind of like a dessert that you can have with your main course. So cool. Caramelized squash and I was going to say mashed potatoes and gravy, and then Rachel made homemade pumpkin pie with whipped cream. See, I'm still in a food coma. That's what I'm talking about. So it's probably not a good time to talk about this subject, it being like 10 to 12. Torture. But we are going to talk about food today, and by food I mean food and drink. The whole, encompass. I'm not going to talk much about drink, but I'm including that. Because, most of us spend an awful lot of time on the matter of food, right? If you took stock, it might be, I don't know what proportion of many people's days has to do with food. We're buying it, or we're cooking it, or we're eating it, or we're cleaning up after it, or we're talking about it, or we're imagining it like you are right now. So there's a lot of preoccupation with the whole subject of food. In Haliburton, this little village, which is not a really big village as villages go, it looks like there's a lot of people this weekend, but when you've all gone, they roll up the street till like next spring. I think there's 2,000 people in the whole township that are like winter residents or something like that. So, but in this little village, we have 2 grocery stores, fairly serious, well-stocked grocery stores. We have 2 fairly major chain drugstores with a whole lot of food in them, if you ever noticed that. A convenience store. I counted roughly about a dozen restaurants and eateries of various kinds, just in the locale here. And of course, this is just stuff off the top of my head, and you can probably think of other stuff, but a farmer's market that comes in every Tuesday all summer. Lots of food things. And then I got thinking about how many of our senses our 5 physical senses have to do with food, right? And I started with 3. I thought there's 3. I mean, obviously taste is hugely about eating and smelling, clearly. I mean, when you smell it, you want to eat it. And then I thought, well, touch, for sure, touch, because, there's texture involved with eating food. And then I thought, oh, hold it. What about, I wasn't going to put in sight and hearing. And then I thought, well, sight for sure, because if food looks good, then, you want your food to look good, then it's more attractive, you want to eat it. But I thought, well, no, I guess not hearing. And then I thought, snap, crackle, pop, Rice Krispies. Right? Definitely a lot of hearing to do with food. And, a huge number, the economy rolls along with food. It's a huge number of our jobs and people's jobs have to do with food. Of these 6 children, all of our kids have worked or continue to work in the food world. And on we go. There's lots we could say about it. Now, so the Bible strongly reflects this human reality. And I find that interesting. I put out a letter that's along this subject for communion this time. I'm guessing that all of you read it and marked, and inwardly digested it. And and I had some Bible passages in there just to kind of cue you onto some of the food things, and I'm sure y'all looked those up as well. And and so, for instance, I won't tell. So one of them was, the creation account. Right in the very beginning of the Bible, the creation account says, "These things will be for your food," when God's creating. Now, some of the things I didn't mention things like the reason Israel ended up in Egypt. And this is kind of a core theme in the Old Testament. The reason they ended up in Egypt was food. There's the whole story of Joseph and how he gets sold by his brothers, ends up in Egypt, ends up prime minister of Egypt, ends up, helping the Pharaoh to stock all kinds of food for the famine that will come, that God showed him would come. And then, of course, the famine hits home back in Palestine, and Jacob sends some of the brothers down to Egypt to check it out, and eventually they all move to Egypt, and because there's food there. And that's how they ended up in Egypt. That was a long story made short. There's a whole lot of chapters of Genesis we just skimmed right through. But that's why they were there and how they ended up there, and then later on the Pharaoh enslaves them, and then they have to be rescued by God, and that's the Exodus. So that's 2 chapters of the Bible we've gone through, all about food. At least, there's a lot of Jewish feasts that are ordained by God, and at least 2 of them have to do with food, the harvest, particularly the first fruits and the Feast of Ingathering. and others, they all have to do with eating food pretty much, but those particularly have to do with the harvest, which is interesting because that's probably where kind of our civilization has got the idea of having a harvest Thanksgiving festival, which this weekend is all about, where we actually get together and we worship God and give thanks for food, for the harvest. But that dates back to those Old Testament days when God ordained that and called his people to be thankful for the food that he was providing for them through the harvest. Right? Now, if you read through any of the Gospels, or all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can't help but notice how much there is in there about food. I mean, it just goes from one chapter to the next. There's food, food, food. I mean, Jesus is always going to some kind of supper, or he's talking about a supper. He's got a parable of the banquet, or he's got a parable of the sower who sows food, or the fisherman that fishes for food. I mean, food, food, food every time you turn around. In fact, Jesus says that what tells us in the Gospels that one of the things they said of him was, he says, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a glutton and a winebibber, or a drunkard. There's a complaint against Jesus because he spent so much time eating and drinking with people. They called him a glutton and a drunkard. And the other thing, another criticism that they levied against him was that he ate with sinners. He ate with sinners. What a terrible thing to do. I don't know how you don't do that. But, of course, in their society, there were those who kind of figured they weren't sinners somehow, because they were above the crowd, especially these religious leaders and some of the more important people. But Jesus, and the thing is, in that culture, and I think still today, and across the board, probably almost universally, when you eat with someone, you bond with that one. When we get together for coffee or we get together for a meal, we're bonding, we're accepting one another, we're strengthening our friendship and the ties that bind through food and through eating together. And so Jesus, essentially, by eating with sinners, was indicating his acceptance of them and his love for them and his welcome of them, which is pretty amazing, through food. So the passage that Lisa read today, you may think, oh, that's a familiar one, and it is. That was from Matthew 15, and that's the feeding of the 4,000. Guess what? It's in the chapter after Matthew 14, which has the feeding of the 5,000. They're two different stories. I don't know if you realize that. They sound almost the same, so when you heard this, you probably thought that's what you were hearing, but you weren't. You were hearing the one-off, the one that we don't usually talk about. See, the first one, the feeding of the 5,000, is what's got a little boy in it, so it's really cute. It's got the little boy, and he's got 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then Jesus feeds the crowd, 5,000 people, and then they pick up 12 basketfuls. I feel like it's baskets full, but that's me. It's like governors general, right? of the pieces left over. Then the next chapter, almost the same story. They're off in a crowd, and Jesus is compassionate because he says they're going to starve, they're going to get starved, and they're going to go away and faint on the way back to their homes. Give them something to eat. And they said, all we got is 7. Now they have 7 loaves and a few small fish. He says, let's go. So they feed 4,000 men, not including the women and children, and then they pick up 7 basketfuls of the pieces left over. All this is in Matthew 14 and Matthew 15. Long, long, long sections about food and feeding people. Isn't that interesting? In fact, one of the really kind of neat things that you may begin to notice about these passages is how they describe what Jesus does. And I've mentioned this in one of my communion letters maybe a year ago, how there's this kind of a rhythm. He takes what's given to him, he thanks God for it, or he blesses it, he breaks it, and then he hands it back out again, and he distributes it back out. And it says the same thing in both these chapters. It says pretty much the same thing at the Lord's Supper. He does the same thing. He takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it. And interestingly, on the road to Emmaus, so the day of the resurrection, Jesus has risen from the dead, but people really aren't aware yet. So he's walking down the road, and he appears to 2 of the disciples who don't recognize him. They're kept from recognizing him. And they walk down the road, and they talk for a few hours. Then they said, come on into our place, we'll have supper. So they come in to have supper, and it says Jesus took the bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it, and it says, and they knew who he was. They recognized him in the breaking of the bread. So this was something that was characteristic of the way Jesus did things, and something that they really kind of connected with him. And so when he did that, that was the point of recognition, which is, I think, interesting. All that being said, why would we ever think that food is not a spiritual thing? I mean, as in, food is common and mundane and earthy or earthly, but worship and prayer and ecstatic experiences are holy and much superior. I don't know if anybody ever said that, but I made that up. But, I'm trying to reflect an attitude that is definitely out there. But Jesus didn't have that attitude. Jesus does not seem to have that view at all, which I think is interesting. So two of the errors, I'm going to get a little bit theological here, but try to make it practical. Two of the errors that plague Christians are called dualism and hedonism or hedonism, okay? Now, you may have, or you probably heard of hedonism or hedonism. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's either or either. So hedonism, and I've got a definition from the world-renowned encyclopedia, Wikipedia. Hedonism is a school of thought that argues that pleasure and happiness are the primary or most important intrinsic goods and the proper aim of human life. It's a school of thought that argues that pleasure and happiness are the primary or most important intrinsic goods. They're the highest things and the proper aim of human life. That's hedonism. May sound familiar because it's pretty much the perspective of our world. It's the thing that people value most. What is going to make me happy and give me pleasure? And that's the high thing. That's the most important thing. That's the thing I'm going for. Right? So that's very common, a very common point of view, even though to call it a school of thought is a little bit strong. It's almost like, I've decided to be a hedonist, which I don't think anybody actually does. You just slip into it. It just pervades so much. And so that Christians who may not actually buy into this as their point of view or their school of thought, it may be their way of life, right? So it's for generations and since Christ's day has pervaded the church, and we've gone that way often. And I call that is to be so earthly minded that you are of no heavenly good, the hedonism. Now, dualism is a little trickier, but so dualism comes with the dual, like there's two sides. It's like there's two sides to us, and we're split in two. Dualism sees pleasure and enjoyment in food and things pertaining to the body as at best weak and unimportant, and the inner spiritual life as far superior and of ultimate importance. So this dichotomy built into us, where there's those mundane, lower things like food and the body and those kinds of things. Then there's the higher things like God and worship and spirituality and all that kind of stuff. And ne'er the twain shall meet almost. And so they kind of disdain the one, but glorify the other one. That is to be so heavenly minded, you are of no earthly good. Okay. Now, the funny thing is that Jesus didn't have that perspective on the things of the world and the body and food and all that, did he? He wove together the common things of life with the invisible realities seamlessly. And it's my thought and belief that we need to learn to do the same. So we can enjoy the beautiful fall leaves and delight in the God who made them at one and the same time. We can eat our turkey and our dressing and our pumpkin pie and our squash and our sweet potatoes and give thanks to the Lord of the harvest who, made these things all possible for us. We can converse and joke and play with our family and friends and worship the God who designed us to live in community, this wise God. Now, all of this is in the Lord's Supper, which is before us today. This is a physical thing. This is real food and drink, which reminds us of a real flesh and blood Savior who shed real blood and died a real death so that we could be forgiven and rescued and healed. Food for thought. Let us pray.